Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. As always, we have a great show for you tonight. There's so much happening in the world right now, especially as relates to foreign policy and military affairs that directly impact our country. And we have probably the best person I can even think of to talk about those today, and that is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired U.S. Army, decorated combat vet, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and friend of the show. Welcome back, Doug.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, I wish, like you said earlier, I wish it was to discuss something pleasant and nice. That's but right, yeah. Unfortunately, we have the truth is oftentimes kind of unpleasant, but it's something that everybody needs to hear. That's why we have you on the show today. But fortunately, though, it's not just a recitation of bad news, but you have some plans and some ideas anyway of hard plans of how we maybe can turn some things around toward the positive, both for Israel, Ukraine, and the United States. But let's jump right into it. Let's first go to the Israeli-Hamas war. And there has been a lot going on there, as most people are aware, that the short pause they've been having to get these hostages released, which we're all for, is probably nearing its end state. There might be another couple of days, and then after that, it's going to turn back into some really ugly combat again. And here's kind of what we have in terms of what people are thinking about where this war is going to be going next.
Don't you think the last 6 weeks have done a lot to incite and inspire a whole new generation of terrorists? I mean, all the civilian deaths. I mean, don't you worry that that in itself is going to raise and inspire a whole new generation of Palestinians who hate Israelis?
It depends what we do next. I want to remind you that in Nazi Germany, in the final months of the war, there were many, many civilian casualties. Yet Germany was denazified after the war, and we had a new Germany. So, look, if anyone has a magic plan how to eradicate Hamas without any collateral damage, bring it on and we'll adopt it. Barring that, we're going to have to get the job done and then denazify Gaza.
You know, he talks there, Doug, like there's really no alternative. All you can do is just kill everybody and we'll not worry about the consequence later. And it'll be like Germany. But there are some major differences between that Germany analogy. Number one, we gave them freedom. We helped them out. They were a completely different culture, as you know better than anybody. And to suggest that because it worked in Germany that you can have the same result here, I think is just nonsense.
Well, you'll recall that I think people like Dr. Wolfowitz and others back under the Bush administration in the early part of the century talked about Iraq as a Nazi state. It seems like every time we go anywhere or do anything, somebody somewhere along the line conjures up this image of Nazis, and that's absurd. It just makes no sense at all. On the other hand, what I think would be a better analogy is to point out that the Israelis want to find a particular school of fish in the ocean and then annihilate those fish. And they found out that that's almost impossible to do. And so they've concluded that the only way to get to the school of fish they want to remove is to drain the ocean. And that's what they're trying to do. Draining the ocean, however, is the path to a larger regional war. And that's where we're headed.
And we're going to talk in just a second about an article you have in the American Conservative Magazine just out today, which is a brilliant piece. I've recommended reading for everybody. In the opening part, you interview or you give a quote from Professor Omer Bartov, who we actually had on the show last week, and he said something on our show that directly relates to what you just said.
The truth is that it's not clear entirely that they can destroy Hamas militarily. I think that ultimately, if they are to remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip as the hegemon, it would not simply be a military operation. It would have to be by some kind of political international agreement. Otherwise, it can become what Lebanon became from Israel, where it ended up staying for 20 years, taking many losses, and then leaving.
You know, that's the whole thing about trying to get the fish. You can't get the fish without killing the bad fish, without killing all the fish that's in there. And if you drain the water, then all the fish get killed. But unless you're going to annihilate the population, you're not going to just get those fish, at least not by trying to just drain the water and kill everybody. And I think that's I don't think that Israel seems to be concerned about that.
Well, Professor Bartov is a very brilliant historian. He knows the historical record well. And as a result, he's acutely sensitive to the problem. The issue, though, is as follows. I think the Israelis understand those things, but I think they've decided this is the time in the history of Israel to effectively remove the Arab population from Gaza. It's very straightforward. They don't expect to successfully root out and kill all of the Hamas fighters. If they do, that's fine. I don't think they believe that they're going to be successful in extricating all of the hostages. So I think instead what they've decided to do is to make virtue of necessity and create a situation that allows them to expel the population from Gaza, because their view is that if it remains in any form, it's a permanent danger to the Israelis and a permanent thorn in the side of the Israeli Defense Force. And if you've got a very serious front to the north, which you do with Hezbollah, if you can eliminate the southern front completely, you're going to do it. And then there is also this larger issue, and this has been around for many decades, the notion of a greater Israel. The idea that everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean should belong to Israel. Now, a lot of people want to point to the Bible or biblical references for that, but the truth is that was a view held by many of the original Zionists, none of whom were particularly religious, let's be frank. Yeah. Many of them were atheists and Marxists and communists. So they could care less about it, but they did want to do something along those lines. And I think that one of the principal reasons that Mr. Netanyahu has decided to do it is this is late in his life. This is, I think, a dream he's had for a long time. He knows he has the support of the Israeli population because they're horrified and shocked by what happened on the 7th of October.
Yeah.
And so he has a degree of support there that he may never have again. And then on top of that, you have the United States. And right now, Mr. Netanyahu speaks with greater authority in Washington, D.C. than President Joe Biden.
And here's how Netanyahu is using that authority.
All Hamas operatives and terrorists must die. Our forces are acting above and beneath the ground, targeting them. We are going to continue full force. We are going to continue until victory. We are also very well prepared in the north. Aggressive fire from the air and from the ground over there. And I have warned Hezbollah, don't make that mistake and enter the war.
So it does pretty much sound like he's using your drain the ocean to go get after those fish mentality. And you addressed this in today's American Conservative magazine. In this article, it was entitled Israel's War of Decision. And one of the most interesting quotes I found out of that was you wrote, the question for Israelis and the Americans that support them is whether Israel's desired end state is an Arab-free state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. If the answer is yes, then the Middle East is indeed on a path to a war of decision, a war that will govern Israel's continued existence and the future extent of America's strategic influence in the Near East and North Africa. So in writing that, when you say this war of decision, are you referring to specifically just within the Gaza Strip, or is this something much larger in the region?
Well, I think it's much larger, frankly. The other thing is Clausewitz talked about two different kinds of wars. He talked about wars of observation, which we would call low-intensity conflict, frankly, the outcome of which is not terribly important to the main player, in our case, the United States. And we treated lesser contingencies in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere as, well, if we're successful, we're successful. If we're not, we go home. The wars of decision involve the existence of the state itself. And I think Mr. Netanyahu has been very clear that as far as he's concerned, the fight in Gaza is an existential one for Israel, that Gaza is the beginning of a decisive outcome that will secure Israel, he hopes, in perpetuity. My fear is that having turned this into a war of decision, he's going to end up in a regional conflict that we cannot help them win. We can try, but I think ultimately they will lose. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, you have the Islamic world, certainly in North Africa and the Middle East, and probably including Asia, is actually quite united in their opposition to what Israel is doing. And the region has changed. 50 years ago, when we had the October 73 war, you could compartmentalize the fight. You could fight the Egyptians on one side, the Syrians on the other. without worrying about others in the region intervening. Today, the entire region is inflamed. The entire region is prepared to intervene in one way or another. And it's no longer just Arabs. Now we're talking not just about Iran, but also
right.
And I think that to press ahead, which I expect is what they will do, I think once this temporary pause is over, that they will go back to doing what they did. They will move south to Khan Yunis, and they will treat Khan Yunis and southern Gaza exactly the way they did northern Gaza. And they will drive more people out. And as this develops and becomes obvious, it will be much harder for the entire region not to become engaged.
Right. And that actually is one of my biggest concerns, because the casualties up to this point have been somewhere around 15,000, depending on who you want to believe. Whatever the number is, it's huge among the Palestinians. And that's causing even many in the United States, many of the former aides of several prominent Democratic senators, they're actually trying to press for them to move more in the direction of ceasefire and trying to find a negotiated settlement. And if the Israeli Defense Forces move further into the south, where the population density is now double what it was in the north, then those numbers could actually skyrocket. And then you have the real risk of losing support at home. And then perhaps, and I don't know whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Turkey, or even somebody right now who doesn't even want to come into the fight. It seems like the pressure will be much greater on the Arabs to do something.
Well, very recently, there was a cabinet meeting, and in the cabinet meeting, everyone but Netanyahu wanted to go ahead and attack Hezbollah. And he very prudently intervened and said, no, we don't want to bring Hezbollah into this war. The problem is what we've just discussed, what you just outlined, will bring Hezbollah into the war. And it's not just Hezbollah. Again, we could talk about this, but you've listened to the statements by Mr. Erdogan. And there's a very dangerous predisposition, both in Israel and Europe and the United States, not to take President Erdogan seriously.
Yes.
It's a serious mistake in my judgment. And he said a number of things. I mean, he spoke publicly and he said, Mr. Netanyahu is no longer a strategic partner with whom we are prepared to discuss anything. He's a war criminal. He leads a war criminal state called Israel. No more negotiations with those people. And then secondly, he went on to say at some point Turkish soldiers would fight in Gaza. But in my judgment, even more important, he said, you've used nuclear weapons to threaten people in the past in the region. Your nuclear weapons will not save you, Mr. Netanyahu, no matter how many you think you have. I think he knows that he can get control of nuclear warheads and weapons from Pakistan. And that's the great fear in Israel has not been that others would gain control of nuclear weapons and use them. It is that if they gain control of a nuclear weapon, they would be able to deter the Israelis from using theirs. That's exactly where I think Mr. Erdogan is headed. Now we have this flotilla. You haven't talked about that. We should a little bit. This flotilla of over 1,000 ships carrying humanitarian assistance, which is supposed to put to sea today. It may already have. I don't know. It would arrive then, I would suspect, Friday or Saturday. And one wonders how that will be greeted by the Israelis.
Yeah, that is a potential real flashpoint. And I think some intend it to be a flashpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the real question, Doug, because all the things you lay out there and the risks of escalation, therefore the risk to the U.S. interest in the region, what can the Biden administration do right now? Because they're under a lot of pressure, double pressure on the one side to have a ceasefire, to do something, and on the other hand, to just stay completely pro-Israel and whatever they say, keep doing. So with those kind of pressures on him, knowing what this could lead to, what should the United States do right now?
Well, I think the United States, if it had real leadership, would intervene and simply say, if you continue on the current path, we will withdraw our forces. In other words, we will not support you. What we want is a ceasefire. I don't care whether or not it suits your interests, but if you're going to pursue this strategy of mass expulsion and potentially murder, then we can't support you. And I think it's pretty clear. You and I are part of a generation of Americans who grew up in an environment where we were acutely sensitive to the Jewish Holocaust of the Second World War.
Right.
And many of us, I know this was strong with me and my family, felt that 6 million Jews had been the down payment on the state of Israel. and that we had an interest, a moral interest in helping Israel survive. We were not going to allow it to be destroyed,
right,
the population murdered, enslaved, driven into the sea. That's not true with the people that have followed us, Dan. The generation that's coming up does not feel that way as we once did. And it becomes increasingly difficult to persuade them to feel that way when they see the Israelis, frankly, behaving the way they have towards the Arabs. And let's be frank, not every Israeli thinks the Arabs are subhuman, but they very definitely are frequently viewed that way and treated that way. And the Arabs have had it. They're not going to put up with it any longer. And they have the numbers. But also, again, there are now people who are not Arabs, the Turks in particular, and the Iranians, who are willing to help. And behind them stand the Russians, and more distantly, the Chinese. Their interests are a little different. In other words, the Chinese don't want the Straits of Hormuz to be closed.
Right.
They're dependent upon the oil and the gas. They want to do business with the Iranians. They're trying to build this Belt and Road. The Russians, they're looking at it from the standpoint of the Americans, constitute in their mind a lunatic state, that wherever we go, we cause misery and destruction.
Certainly for them, yeah.
And so the Russian view is that we can't let them do that to the region, to the Middle East. I mean, some of your viewers will remember when Syria was being destroyed in the civil war, Putin said, what has to happen to satisfy America? Does every single building and every single Syrian have to die? Does everything have to be destroyed to satisfy American strategic interests? Remember, we were supporting people that you and I, on any normal day, would have shot without hesitation,
right,
ISIS-like characters. We were supporting them against Mr. Assad. And this was in part because the Israelis insisted that Assad was bad. But the truth is, there were many people in Israel and many in the West that said, well, you may not like Assad, but he maintains a degree of stability over there, which is useful. I remember Edward Luttwak, who was shocked when the Israelis and the Americans demanded that Assad withdraw all the Syrian forces from Lebanon. He said, don't you understand what you're doing? You pull those forces out, who will keep order? Who will keep a lid on the chaos? Well, nobody cared. And the Syrian civil war erupted, and God knows how many people have died over there and how terrible it's been, certainly on the scale of the Spanish Civil War. So I think the Russians are taking the position, if we have to support Turkey and if we have to support Iran in the event that we, the Americans, unwittingly follow the Israeli lead and widen this region, then we will do so. They have to be stopped.
Yeah, and that's what worries me. This thing could really just blow out of hand. I think too many people, Doug, believe what you said, that whether it's Erdogan or Hezbollah or Iran, they're going to be deterred. Ultimately, Israel can do whatever it wants, and this will go back to some kind of pacifist issue, and we'll just get it off the front legs. And I think that's a bad gamble, not just even a hope to base your policies on, which it seems we're doing. Unfortunately, that's not the only bad place I think where we have some problematic policy towards our own interest, and that is in the Russia-Ukraine war. And in the remainder of the time we have here, I want to jump over to that because, well, I think we have some bad precedents of where we're even going right now. And we had the Secretary of State the other day said, in this circumstance that after this failed offensive, after Ukraine has almost utilized all of their manpower, now they're going down to 18-year-old kids, after they have lost, so much of the armored vehicles, and they don't even, now they're running low on air defense missiles, and we're running low on the ability to restock it. And in the light of all that, you have Secretary of State saying this.
To put Ukraine on a solid foundation for the next year, we must help Ukraine do 4 things at once. First, keep fighting to win back its territory. Second, build a world-class military force to ensure maximum deterrence for the long term and make clear to President Putin that he cannot and will not outlast Ukraine, and he cannot and will not outlast all of Ukraine's supporters. Third, kickstart economic recovery and growth and bring more hope, more opportunity to the Ukrainian people. And fourth, accelerate the reform process to speed Ukraine's path to the European Union and to attract investment.
Doug, this is, I have to give my wife credit on this one. Francis the other day said, this sounds something more like the unicorn strategy. It would be great if this was the truth. And yet he's actually pinning us to that, but there's no foundation for it, is there?
Well, actually, I thought he was going to mention to put Ukrainian astronauts on the moon in the near future. I mean, it's about as ridiculous. It's absurd. It's insane. It has no chance of happening. And Russians are capturing 70-year-old men. The Russians are capturing 13, 14, 15-year-old boys. The Russians are now finding women dead on the battlefield.
Yeah, that.
This is insane. This war is lost. Now, there's a battle happening in Avdiivka right now, as you know. That's turning into a bloodbath for the Ukrainians, but it's also turned into a rough fight for the Russians because many of the fortifications the Russians are attacking were built over many years. So it has not been an easy nut to crack. But it's going to turn out badly for Ukraine. And the question is, will any of these general officers in the Ukrainian army step forward and say, that's it, enough's enough? And someone asked me the other day, do you think there are any Ukrainian patriots in uniform that will do that? And I said, I don't know. It's incomprehensible to me because Ukraine never had a chance to win this thing. And the notion of building a world-class military, it takes decades to build that sort of force.
You literally wrote the book on that one. Several of them, actually.
So anyhow, he's a fool, and he's making fools out of us, and he's helping to sacrifice millions of lives for nothing.
Now, what is the risk here for the United States if we keep saying, yeah, well, I mean, eventually we're going to give them some money. We're going to have a show on tomorrow where Senator Rand Paul tells us flatly he's not giving another dollar to Ukraine because he said there's no American interest in it, and he listed a bunch of other reasons, but he's not the only one. So it's not at all clear that there's going to be more money, or if it is, it's probably going to be a lot less than what anybody's hoping. But it's in no way going to be enough to turn the tide at any point in the foreseeable future, not the least of which because they won't have the manpower to use that if they get it. That being the case, where is this war going to go? Can it stay a stalemate like many in Washington want, or is there a risk that at some point the Ukraine army buckles?
Well, I think the Ukrainian army is buckling. That's happening. There's no question about it. The issue is on the Russian side. The Russians have the initiative now, Dan. And today, Putin made a statement. I say today, I received it this morning. It may have happened yesterday. I don't know. In which he said that there was no point in talking to Washington until after the election. So the Russians have written off the Biden administration, have no intention of holding discussions or talks with them at all. So I think the Russians are looking to Europe, wondering whether or not someone with character and intelligence will emerge in Berlin or Paris or somewhere else to step forward and say, we're going to take ownership of this disaster. We're going to help stop it and chart a path to peace. I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't. I wish it would, but we're a long way from that. I think we're going to have to see some changes in the governments, and the Europeans have been very slow to do that. Now, what does that mean? I think the Russians are going to hold what they have. They have, I'm told, already put together a series of terms, and I think they're going to want to control everything from Odessa to Kharkov. And you're going to have this historic area that was called New Russia fundamentally under their control. Now, people say, well, that's unacceptable. We're not going to accept that. That's fine. Then the Russians are going to say, then we'll continue.
I'm not asking your question, permission.
Yeah, we're going to move further west. And I think they will. They'll move slowly. There's an example of this. In 1918, the Bolsheviks sat down with the Imperial General Staff of the German Army and said, we're willing to do this or that or the next thing. And the Germans said, listen, we don't care, what you want to do. This is a line. It was called Brest-Litovsk. We're drawing this line. Yeah. And that's where we're going to draw the line with your current state called the Soviet Union. Bolsheviks said, well, we don't care. We're not going to go along with this. Well, next thing that happened was that General Max Hoffman got on the phone, called up and said they don't want to do business. So 400,000 German troops began moving towards Moscow. Well, within 24 hours, Lenin said, sign anything they ask you to. End this. We won't survive this. And he was right. And I think something like that will eventually happen with the Ukrainians because the Russians are going to do what the Germans did. The difference, of course, is the Russians aren't fighting on a second or third front against other enemies. They've only got one front. That front's in Ukraine. They can manage that very effectively. And so they're going to get whatever they want, whether we like it or not. We should be interested in the humanitarian dimension. We don't seem to be interested in that. They don't need any more weapons. They don't need any more bullets. They need an end to this disaster. Right. We can rescue what's left of the Ukrainian nation. And I don't know how much is left, Dan.
You see, and that's my just anguishing frustration is that fundamentally, as we talk about literally every time we get on the air here, or you and I talk on the phone or whatever, it is clear there is no military fundamental that should give anyone any kind of rational hope that Ukraine could win the war on the battlefield. There's none, not even a little bit. Therefore, at the end of this is already ordained, and Russia clearly appears willing to pay a large price for it, both in manpower and personnel and equipment and everything else. But they have it, and they're going to pay it. That should be now clear to everyone. The difference is that if a negotiation was made today, if whether Biden said, "Hey, Zelensky, we're going to give you about a third of what you're asking for, and there ain't any more coming. You need to negotiate." Or if Zelensky on his own came to that conclusion and recognized they could make a negotiation and probably get most of what they currently have right now. But if they don't, if they continue bullheadedly saying, no, we're going to try to go against reality, then I think what you described is probably the most likely outcome, which is that they could lose substantially more territory, and then they'll be given terms. They won't even get to negotiate. That's my worry, that thousands more people could die for no reason to their own country.
Well, you know that no one in Washington is going to stand up and admit that they were wrong about anything.
Yeah, we do have precedent with
the administration. Yeah. All the underlying assumptions were wrong. Russia is weak. No, Russia's not weak. If we put enough pressure on the Russians, they'll overthrow this man, Putin. Nonsense. He's stronger now than he's ever been. The Russian economy is performing brilliantly, much better than our Western economies.
It's amazing.
And the Russian military that began this process was always too small for the kind of war that presented itself to the Russians. But again, remember, the Russians didn't expect us to react the way we did. They actually thought we were going to negotiate with them and wanted to avoid a war. When they finally figured out that wasn't the case, it took them 6 to 7 months to build up their force. Today, they are more powerful and more capable than they have been since the 1980s. It's an excellent force. Yeah. But again, they don't want to invade Eastern Europe. This is the big myth.
Right.
You know, just on talking to some Germans, and they pointed out that the German defense minister says, we Germans now have to prepare for war. So we're going to have to spend lots of money to rebuild the old army. And I said, well, first of all, you don't want the old army because that's the wrong answer for the future. But secondly, where's the evidence? I mean, if the Russians wanted to march west, they'd already be doing it. And they're not doing it. They don't want to march west. They want to return to some degree of normalcy to do business. We are the ones that are preventing it. And we're telling Zelensky, well, we would like you to take ownership of the disaster. I'm sure Zelensky says, well, listen, you told me that you would guarantee victory. And now you want me to stand up and take the blame for everything that's wrong when everything that's happened is because of you. You know, ultimately, I think he'll board a plane and fly somewhere if he survives. And as I've said before to other people, I think he'll end up with a nice pick in his skull at some point anyway. But in the meantime, you know, what happens to the Ukrainian people? Nobody seems to give a damn about that.
I know.
I don't understand it. It's incomprehensible to me.
Yeah, this idea that you know, no, we care about free and all this, and we're going to help them win. That's an aspiration. That's a unicorn. If we could just do what we want to do, no matter what the realities, it would be cool. But the realities are there. There's no unicorn, and you're condemning people to die in pursuit of something that's militarily unattainable. And that is, I just still can't get my head wrapped around that, because there should be more people that understand what you have been talking about. But I don't know if they don't know, or if they don't care, which might be worse than not knowing. But either way, it's bad for Ukraine. It's bad for the United States. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for right now, Doug. There's so much more we can talk about. And unfortunately, neither one of these topics are going away anytime soon. We're going to continue asking you to come on and, you know, share with us what the U.S. could do in each of these phases as we get further in to try and cut off the bleeding.
Well, give my best to Senator Rand Paul. And remember, he's one of the few voices of sanity on the Hill who from the very beginning warned against all this. He's in the position of having been right. No one's going to give him credit for it in the Senate, obviously, because they're all warmongers, and they're all on the payroll of various warmongers. That's the problem in Washington. Washington is, to paraphrase Ralph Nader, he used to say it's corporate occupied territory. I call it donor occupied territory now. We have our oligarchs that have bought up various members of the House and the Senate. That's why we do the things we do. Americans need to wake up and understand that. But Rand Paul is the great exception, deserves credit for that.
He does. We're actually going to ask him about that very thing tomorrow. But we thanks for having you on there, Doug. And we're going to continue to bring you shows just like this. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth that you need. Please be sure to like and subscribe and pass this on to anybody that you know that also wants the truth, because we're going to keep giving it to you. Thanks, and we'll see you next episode of Deep Dive.